Now we're going to turn to our guest who has written a book. He's written several books, but this particular one that we carry at Infowars.com, Survivors, talks about what's going to happen after the collapse or what leads up to it and the things that people did to prepare. It's Survivors by James Wesley Rawles, a novel of the coming collapse. And Jim Rawles is a former U.S. intelligence officer and survivalist. He's got survivalblog.com, and he's been writing since the mid-'80s, since he got out to college. So let's welcome him on the show. Hey, Jim, how's it going?
Just fine. Thanks for having me on.
So I read this book, I guess 2 months ago. Somebody had left it on the book counter, and the cover is what caught my eye. You got a guy walking in on a horse. He's got an AK with no stock strapped to his back. And there's fires and basically, something out of a scene of the road. Looks like he's walking into. So tell us a little bit about Survivors.
Sure. Survivors is a novel set in the near future. It describes a classic hyperinflation and socioeconomic collapse that's very severe. It brings the power grids down and essentially brings our national economy to a grinding halt. And it's a sequel to my novel Patriots, which has been kind of a perennial favorite in preparedness circles since the early 90s. And it follows a number of characters and their reactions to the economic collapse and how they scramble to how they react, how they pull through that situation. In my first novel, Patriots, I had the main characters were fairly well prepared. In Survivors, which is set in the exact same time period but different geography, the main characters are not very well prepared for the collapse. And I get the opportunity there to talk about a lot of alternative ways to get through hard times,
right?
Techniques and technologies.
To me, it seems like this book is geared toward people who may have been thinking about these types of issues, but they aren't going into the action phase. They, the one lady is hoarding seeds. She doesn't really know why, but she's gotten some advice, and she's going to hoard seeds. The one group who has the farm out in the West, they find that their father was really well prepared when they break open, the wall. I'm giving some of the book away, but they break open this wall and find a cache of silver and guns and, stuff. So it shows that what I like, that it's not totally impossible to get yourself prepared. Even if you've only done one or two things, you could still get in that mindset and still continue along the path, because, this is something that even our government officials are saying that could happen within 2 years now. They put a timetable on it.
That's right. And of more immediate concern, we're looking at a Greek financial crisis that may come to a head in as little as 5 weeks. There's a lot of concern that the Greek crisis could, in addition to just breaking apart the European Union, cause massive bank runs, a major liquidity crisis with cascading margin calls rippling their way all the way around the planet, stock market collapses, bond market problems with failed governmental bond auctions. It could be a serious problem.
I agree. And what I've been telling people in my circle of friends and the people I know is that what you're going to see in Europe, we're 2 to 3 years down the line is going to happen here. We've got a little, I think by being so spread out, I think there are things that would take longer to hit some places than others. But definitely in the cities, you're going to have, some immediate problems, say if the electricity goes out for some extended period of time. But what in your opinion, what is Europe going to do if once these, countries like Greece and then Portugal, Italy, when these smaller countries start to go bankrupt, what do you think is going to happen to the rest of Europe?
Well, it's very difficult to predict, but suffice it to say, I think we could see, at the very minimum, some large bank runs and a collapse on the of the FTSE in England and all the other major stock indices in Europe, starting with the financial stocks. We could very well see considerable turmoil, and if it turns into a global credit collapse, it could have some very wide-reaching repercussions. One of the great imponderables is the derivatives market. There are hundreds of trillions of dollars in derivatives in play at any given time, and because the derivatives market is essentially new, it's really built up just in the last 8 years. It really doesn't have a track record. It wasn't there in 1987 when they had the stock market collapse. Then there was no real derivatives market at that time. Well, there was a fraction of what exists now. Nothing near the scale that exists now. So the counterparty risk for derivatives is huge. And if entire counterparties disappear, and some of those counterparties are actual sovereign risks, as in national governments, if those governments can't meet those obligations, the implications could be enormous.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to your book. One of the things I like about the book, and if you guys want to get an overhead shot of this, that'd be great, is, and a lot of people do this, but your quotes, I really liked each one, and I had to read a couple of them several times over. But in chapter 3, you have a Thomas Jefferson quote, probably one most people have seen. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations will grow up around them, will deprive the people of all their property until their children wake up homeless and the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Now,
that I think is actually a paraphrase, because they didn't use the terms inflation and deflation in that time period, but it is a good one.
Yeah. Well, I liked how you started each chapter with one of those, and how, you've got the one character who's in the he's in the army overseas, and he's got to make his way back through a Europe that has also collapsed, and using gold and silver. Talk about some of the things. I forget the character's name right off the top of my head. His
name is Andy Lane. He's an Army captain,
right,
who's released from active duty in Afghanistan just as the collapse is unfolding. And he's sent back to Germany as part of his out-processing, but then he ends up getting stranded, and there's all the commercial flights have been grounded, both because of the economic turmoil and because of some hijackings and bombing terrorism that's going on. There's no flights going back to the United States. Even the military airlift command flights have been totally disrupted. So he has to find his way back to the United States in the midst of all of this. It makes for a pretty dramatic story.
It does, because he doesn't come right back to the United States. He has to make his way.
The story away, but
yeah,
he has really great adventures on the way.
He does, and it's a great book. One of the other parts is the bad guys in this is a roving gang that just grows and grows and grows as it goes and just conquers each kind of holdout settlement. What kind of research did you do into this gang type of warfare that could happen?
Researching MS-13, which is a particularly violent gang, and their modus operandi really isn't too much different in the novel from what they do today, except if you end up in a situation without rule of law, where there's a vacuum of law enforcement, the gangs will have the opportunity to, run rampant and take over entire towns. There'll be basically no one to stop them other than the local citizenry, and if they can overpower or intimidate them, I think there's a potential for gangs taking over at least small towns quite easily, and that's what I portrayed in the book.
Right.
I think until the third book, where I describe the comeuppance of that gang. People have to wait for my second sequel to Patriots, which is titled Founders. That's coming out in November of this year.
Okay. And one more section in Survivors that I thought was interesting was the way people were forming bonds in communities out of necessity. People would show up and they had supplies that would help with another group, specifically the husband and wife who are flying in their little flying machines and ending up in places, and then they pick up and take off. I guess what's the mindset of people? The mindset of people that are going to have to rebuild communities. What is going to happen if we do get into a crunch situation?
Well, in the crunch, I think people are going to have to either pull together or perish. There really needs that. If there's going to be any rebuilding, it really needs to be done from the bottom up. If the experience of Hurricane Katrina taught us anything, it is that disaster response fails horribly when it's from the top down.
Right.
But the response from the bottom up, from the community grassroots level, can be quite effective. And in both my novel Patriots and later in Survivors, I described how people do that.
Well, and I noticed that there's not a lot of government solutions in this book. In fact, there seems to be a lack of government.
The second part of it, where just like in Patriots, there's a foreign occupational army that comes in, and there's a war of resistance against them. But that's the only real government that springs up in terms of top-down government, and it's bad government. And a lot of the drama in both novels involves trying to restore constitutional government.
So what got you started into writing on these subjects? What was your impetus for that?
I was an Army intelligence officer, and a lot of my research, and some of which was in the classified arena, led me to believe that modern societies are very fragile. And I recognized in all these country studies, seeing country after country, where the fragility of the system can meet a brick wall and things can fall apart very quickly and easily. It's happened again and again all over the world. And then I recognized the fact that our own society was even more fragile because we have even longer chains of supply. We have an even greater dependence upon the power grids in particular and technology in general. And that's why in the winter of 1990, 1991, I began drafting my novel Patriots.
So you saw the handwriting on the wall of something that could potentially happen.
Right.
If, well, some things we can't stop. I know that we can at least speak out against our governments that are, and the banking systems that look like they are imploding this stuff by design, on purpose, and just so they can go around and collect up the pieces after they fall.
Yes, in my conversation with Alex Jones earlier this week, part of our conjecture was whether there might be a planned economic collapse, but both Alex and I wondered if that situation might get beyond their control. Mm-hmm. They might stage a crisis as part of the Hegelian dialectic, but then if the reins of power get out of their hands, if society collapses so completely that there's no longer a functioning military, no longer a functioning law enforcement system, and no longer a functioning financial system, basically it's out of their hands. They basically have created a house of cards. It will fall in front of them, and they won't be the ones putting things back together.
Right. No, it's going to be up to us. And that's what people have to look in the mirror and realize, that the solutions are not going to come from the government. They're not going to come from the police. These guys are going to be trying to protect their families. As you point out in your book, at this Air Force base, all of a sudden there was nobody there minding the armory, and that's because these people are going to be running to the hills as well, or trying to take care of their families and their loved ones.
Right. It is important that people plan ahead and that they stock up and train as best as they can. It'll only be the families that are well prepared where you'll have people that can keep an eye on the big picture.
Right.
Be part of the real solution. Because if you're worried about where you're going to get your next meal, you're not going to be in any position to be one of the ones that is restoring order.
Well, let's go into some of those things. What can some people do to prepare? What are like a top 5, I guess, that people can do right now?
The top of the list would be water filtration. and identifying open water sources that you can draw water from. Then beyond that, of course, food storage, starting out by just doubling up on the staple foods that you buy on a regular basis, things like pasta, wheat, rice, beans, honey, things that store for a long period of time. And then beyond that, moving on to longer term storage foods. Some of those, if they're vacuum-packed, freeze-dried foods, they can have up to a 30-year shelf life. They're fairly expensive, though, compared to just bulk foods. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, of course, first aid and advanced medical equipment, communications equipment, and firearms. Lots and lots of ammo in particular is crucial.
Yeah, I'm going to share a story with you. I've got a couple friends who they say when some of their other friends go over and say, "Why do you have so many guns?" They say, "Well, I have a gun for you, and I have a gun for him, and I have a gun for this guy down the street because you guys don't have any." And, they're prepared. I'm prepared, not nearly as much as I should be. I think you could always do a little bit more to get prepared. And especially as you see, the writing on the wall that something bad could very well happen in the next, couple of years, next 3 or 4 years. I mean, we are kind of walking this fine line with the technology, with, the electrical grid. I mean, the sun could knock everything out. You never know. It might not even be a government or a terrorist that gets us. It could just be the sun decides it wants to shoot out a few flares and knocks everything out. And then, where are you going to be?
That's right. Well, you touched on something that's pretty important, and that is having extra on hand for charity. Charity is one of the themes that runs through all of my writings. And if you're going to go overboard in any area, you can't go too far wrong with extra food, extra fuel, and extra ammunition. Because if you missed out on stocking up on anything, if you overlooked anything, you can make up for that with barter. And there's nothing quite like common caliber ammunition as the ultimate barter item.
All right. Most
families only have a few hundred rounds of ammunition at most on hand. They're suddenly going to want several thousand rounds, you'll say. So if you have extra common caliber ammunition, you're going to be in the catbird seat in terms of barter.
And a little tidbit out there, I believe 9mm is the most common handgun ammunition. Is that correct?
It is now globally, yes. Although one thing I recommend is that people do some research and find out what caliber their local police department and their local sheriff's department uses. And even if you don't own a gun chambered in those calibers, stock up a few hundred rounds of those, because you want to have lots of folks on your side. Nothing better than being able to either have barter or charity ammunition on hand.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, tell everyone about your blog.
Well, Survival Blog has been around since August of 2005. We got our start providentially just a month before Hurricane Katrina. And it's grown by leaps and bounds. It's basically doubled each year for the first 4 years it was in existence, and it started to plateau now. But we now have a huge number of visits each week. We have a very loyal readership. It's primarily readers in the U.S. and Canada, and then to a lesser extent other English-speaking countries, and then a smattering globally. We have about 300,000 unique visits per week. We've in total had almost 40 million unique visitors since 2005. And the beauty of Survival Blog is that it's all free. All of the archives are available for people to roam through at will. It's fully searchable by topic. You can type in a keyword in our search box and bring up whatever topic you'd like. There's over 15,000 archived articles, letters, and quotes that people can delve into. And I recommend that people make hard copies of the most crucial articles because, of course, in a grid down situation, you're not going to have access to the internet. And then as a backup, we also have an archive CD that's available at very low cost. I recommend people get that as well. That gives you all of the archives of Survival Blog on a CD, or you can put it on a memory stick to have that available.
I have been printing stuff out for years just because you never know. Lots of practical stuff, how to, Make your own fishing snares and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's nothing beats a hard copy for long-term.
And you can always burn it if you need to.
Yeah, to keep warm, God forbid.
Yeah. You know, you've traveled across the country. You've interviewed people. You've been on speaking engagements. How many people across the country do you think are in that preparedness state of mind? I mean, we got shows on the cable networks now talking about people who are getting prepared and stuff like that. So it's kind of entering the vernacular a little bit. But what's your?
It is entering the national psyche, but in terms of real practical, tangible preparedness, there's a lot more people interested in preparedness than those who've actually gotten off their tail and done anything about it. I'd say in terms of people that are actually tangibly preparing, I'd say it's only about 2% of the population, which is kind of pitiful, but it's better than nothing. And each person that gets prepared represents one less person who's going to be rushing into the grocery store at the 11th hour and cleaning out the shelves. So everyone who stocks up now is part of the solution, not part of the problem.
That's true. Are you looking at any timetables in particular? Are you seeing anything that's telling you something might be coming up? What do you have on your radar?
Well, right now, my most immediate concern is Greece and the Greek debt situation spiraling out of control. But beyond that, it's really hard to put a date on anything. You know, back in the late 1990s, we had the firm date of Y2K to look at. The only vague date that we can look at right now would be the next peak in the solar cycle. The sunspot cycle is supposed to peak in about 5 years because it's, you know, an 11-year cycle. And if we have a severe cycle, then there's a chance of a major Carrington event style solar flare that could happen within the next 5 years. Beyond that, though, I don't like to put a date on anything because I think it's presumptuous. And it also is short-sighted because if you either try to put a date on something or name a particular scenario, you're boxing yourself in. It's better to prepare for every possible event so that you don't get blindsided. It would be very embarrassing to prepare just for an economic collapse and then get nuked. That if you're building a home shelter, it should be more than just a storm shelter. It should be more than just a walk-in vault. It should also be a combination blast and fallout shelter. I'm one of those all of the above kind of guys.
Well, that sounds like good advice. And people can learn more about that on survivalblog.com, I take it.
Correct, yes, and it's all available free, as I mentioned. I do have some books in print, and they're nice, handy references, and they're a great thing to put in someone's hands to get them motivated. But I'm basically a man on a mission. My goal is not to sell books. My goal is to get America prepared.
Right. And that's where we all need to be. I was an Eagle Scout, and that's our motto, be prepared, you know, and that's what you have to start with. And I just recently returned from a ski trip, and we got off the plane. One of my buddies didn't have his straps for his snowboard. Well, I pulled out the bungee cords because I always carry bungee cords. And, you know, it all starts with the mindset, and then you got to go into the action phase. Jim Rawles, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, we'll have you back on soon, and I'm sure you have a lot to talk about. So I'm sure Alex may even have you in guest hosting one day. So,
well, sure, I'd be happy to.
That'd be great. All right, there he goes. There's Jim Rawles. Here's the book, Survivors. I read it. It's a combination fiction novel with a lot of practical tips involved of things you can do today to get in that mindset so you are a survivor, so you're not somebody left out in the cold when it happens. Before we leave, we got the daily quote. And this is from the book, chapter, I think this is, I forget what chapter, I think it's chapter 5 of Survivors. And it's from John Adams. The government turns every contingency into an excuse for enhancing power in itself. And that is from Survivors. You can pick it up at Infowars.com. I recommend you get it. It's a great book. I read it in about 2 weeks, off and on, and it's got a lot of great tips. So There you go. Don't be left out in the cold. Start preparing today. I'm preparing. Reading that article earlier today about the Trinity. The Trinity speakers say U.S. must share sacrifice. That really started putting a timetable, at least in my head. Before I was just kind of planning for general events, but now I am looking at actual, an actual timetable that we have to start looking at. Because if we don't change our ways, if it's all about increasing taxes and increasing the debt and not doing anything about that, and the economy's not going to grow, therefore there's not going to be any change in where we're going. And when the chips fall, the bankers are going to be there picking stuff up, pretending like they didn't know it was going to happen. So that's our show. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider becoming a member at prisonplanet.tv or at infowarsnews.com. And we do this 5 days a week. Every night, we're bringing you the news that we think is important, not the fluff about who's talking about who or who's doing what to who. I mean, we're looking at real issues here. And join us in this crusade to wake people up. Let's get people prepared out there. Let's not sit around and pretend we didn't hear it, we don't know anything, and then when it finally happens, we're going to wish we've done something. We're going to wish we've bought that, some storable food, got some silver, got some firearms, learned how to use the firearms properly. I mean, it's one thing to get a handgun. It's another thing to know how to clean it, take it apart, load it under duress, and fire and hit your target. So with that, I'm Rob Dew. This is Infowars Nightly News. I'd like to thank Paul Joseph Watson for doing the news portion. And we'll be back here next week. Alex will be out on the road. He's got 2 speaking engagements, one in Dallas and one in Orlando the next 2 Sundays coming up. So we'll have a variety of guests anchoring the Infowars Nightly News. I'll be one of them, Aaron Dykes. We're going to get McBreen back in here, and possibly even John Bound, who you've heard his voice on a few projects, but I think we're going to get him in here, sit him down, reading the news under the lights of the Infowars studios. That's all for now. I'm Rob Dew. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out prisonplanet.tv.